Welcome to the Life After Sugar podcast, the podcast that's not just about sugar, but about your relationship with it and also with food and especially with yourself. So if you want to discover your life after sugar and hear inspiring stories from all kinds of people who also cut out sugar in their way, at their pace, for their own reasons, this is the podcast for you. Because when you take away the sugar, you can finally discover the real sweetness in your life. I'm your host, Netta Gorman. And in this week's episode, you know how on my website and on a lot of health-related websites, you have these disclaimers that tell you to consult a doctor or a health professional before you make any kind of change in your diet or your lifestyle. I would imagine including cutting sugar and or intermittent fasting. Well, my guest today, Dr. Paul, freely admits that as a doctor, his medical training didn't really include much information about nutrition altogether, let alone specifically about sugar or about intermittent fasting. So although I'm not saying here that you shouldn't consult a doctor or a health professional, you'll see that in this week's episode, Dr. Paul and myself question the depth of nutrition training that doctors get or don't get. We'll get to our chat in just a minute. But first, I just wanted to tell you that if you're looking for some free resources about how to get rid of cravings, then I have plenty for you. First, download my 5 tips to get rid of cravings. And those 5 tips may not be what you think they are. So go to aftersugarclub.com and download your 5 tips today. And come check out the Life After Sugar Facebook page and subscribe to the Life After Sugar YouTube channel, as well as my Instagram account at MyLifeAfterSugar, which is where you'll get all kinds of inspiration so that you can see that it's perfectly possible to live a happy and active life, even if you don't eat sugar. You can also check out my TikTok account at Netta_lifeaftersugar. So today I'm talking with Paul Kolodzik, who is an MD in emergency medicine. And Paul, just before we talk about your medical background, can you tell us a bit about your background with food and especially with sugar?
Yeah, so like most physicians, we don't get much medical training on nutrition. And so I kind of found my own way related to this. Personally, I was never really overweight, but I was about maybe 20 pounds overweight. And when my kids were in high school, my 2 boys wrestled. And so they were very into nutrition and controlling their weight. And I kind of learned from them over a period of years. And what I've learned over a period of time is avoiding sugar, low carb, and making sure you get adequate protein in really was the way to both better health and better longevity, I believe, as we'll talk about. So I developed that approach for myself. And then because of influences in the emergency department and seeing a lot of disease related to sugar, I developed my own medical practice.
Okay, all right. Can we go all the way back to your childhood? And
Okay.
did you grow up in Ohio?
I did. I
Yeah.
did. Yeah.
So what was that like food-wise, growing up in I guess a regular American family?
Yeah. Yeah. So there was some diabetes on my mother's side and some obesity on my mother's side. But the biggest influence in my childhood actually was my father having some heart disease. And this was right in that era, right at the beginning of the 1970s, when cholesterol became public enemy number one. The food pyramid came out, and we were told overnight that we needed to avoid fat, and carbs were the way to go. And our dietary habits changed here in the States, and I think in Canada as well, as
Mhm.
cholesterol became public enemy number one. And my perspective really is that not has not served us well over the years. You can look at us being told that we needed to eat more carbs, and then you can see shortly after that the epidemic of obesity taking off. A few years after that, the epidemic of diabetes taking off. And now I think the result of that is the vascular disease that we have as well. So I remember that distinctly. You couldn't have butter, you had to have margarine, you had to cut your fat way down. And that was prevalent in my household because of my father's disease. And I've kind of re-educated myself since then.
Yes, yes. So when you first started out in your med school in your studies, did you have sort of like preconceived ideas about what causes heart disease and just general health problems? Was it fat causes all
Yeah,
these?
yeah. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Yeah, I mean, the focus has always been on cholesterol. And in my metabolic health practice, insulin resistance is a much bigger issue than cholesterol for the vast majority of my patients. But yeah, the focus is on cholesterol. And then, of course, there became economic incentives related to the pharmaceutical industry related to that with, the need for statins. And I think that has continued to this day. I think the low carb movement over the last 30 or 40 years, and you can't call it a fad anymore because if it's been going on for 30 or 40 years, it's not a fad any longer. But I think we're beginning to understand that the inflammation we get to the lining of our arteries and our joints from high blood sugar, glucose molecules literally attaching to the linings of our blood vessels, I think again is much more significant for most people than a mildly or even moderately elevated cholesterol level.
And is this something that you learned in med school about insulin resistance?
It wasn't taught to any great degree. I mean, the approach to insulin resistance was at that point that it existed. And the way to treat it was with insulin. And that's what we've done, for many, many years. Basically, in a lot of the approach on nutrition with diabetics and pre-diabetics really has been, the disease management model that we have today, which is, if your blood sugar goes up, we'll just give you more insulin. We'll just go ahead and treat that. So insulin really was a tool, and there was very little emphasis on the fact that you can actually reverse your pre-diabetes or put your diabetes in remission to avoid the problems associated with those diseases. So, I think that's still an issue with mainstream medicine. Docs, primary care docs, who are the backbone of medicine, I think, get 20 minutes with their patients once or twice a year. They don't have time to delve into these issues. And unfortunately, they've been relegated. And I got a lot of friends that are primary care doctors to, well, your blood pressure's up. We're going to, modify your medicine, or your blood sugar's high. We're going to keep an eye on that, or we're going to start a medicine for that, as opposed to doing what you and I know is best, which is let's go ahead and address that through nutrition and activity.
Yes. And it's sort of quite a common belief that doctors give drugs because they get some sort of financial kickback, or that they're sort of the pawns in the pharma industries, big game. Is that the case for you? Or was it
No,
the case?
yeah, I really don't. I don't see a lot of that happening. In the old days, there are new rules in place that prevent these trips and even lunches, and I don't think that's the case. I think it's just the way the medical system is set up. I don't think docs intentionally push medications on people because they have some other incentive. I think there's a knowledge base issue that really they've been professionalized and taught, for example, that cholesterol is the enemy, and when the focus really should be more on insulin resistance. And in the States, it's a timing issue. When I got out of school, a lot of docs worked in their own private practices, I worked in some small towns, and the docs had relationships with their patients and had the opportunity to spend a little bit more time with them. And now most docs are, I know in Canada you have a public system, but in the States, they work for health systems and their schedules are regulated. And I think it's just that they don't have the time and the ability for another deeper intervention like I'm able to provide in my practice. I don't think there's evil intent. It's just that I think they're trying to, basically bail the boat. And the way to do that is to distribute medication as opposed to get to the root of the problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's a good distinction to make. And we just mentioned insulin resistance, and I'd like to have your sort of definition of it as a doctor. What is
Okay.
insulin resistance?
Okay, so this is the way I look at insulin resistance and the way I explain it to my patients is that when you eat a carbohydrate and it sugar, everybody knows sugar is bad, or at least they should after listening to you.
Mhm.
Um, but carbs, other carbs, pasta, refined grains, rice, they immediately get absorbed in your system as glucose. And so when you eat a carb, glucose rises. So far, so good. That's an energy source. The pancreas releases insulin, which is the key in the lock to allow that blood glucose to go into your organs. And when I say organs, I always like to use muscles as an example, and there's a reason for that. We'll come back to it. And so that provides energy to those organs. But if you're eating excessive carbs, like we have since the 1970s, when we were told 50% of our diet should be carbs, then that blood glucose stays high for a long period of time. And once those organs have all the energy they need, they don't listen to the insulin anymore. This is the way I ask my patients to think about insulin resistance. It's like the pancreas doesn't get the message. It keeps kicking out insulin to try and force that blood glucose into those organs, but the organs don't need any more blood glucose. So they resist the signal from insulin. That's what insulin resistance is. Blood sugar is toxic. So if as it rises, something has to happen to it. And so it goes to the liver and gets converted to fat. Causes problems like fatty liver disease, but mostly gets deposited around our midsection as visceral fats. So that's what insulin resistance is in terms of the organs resisting taking in blood sugar and then that ultimately causing fat. And the way to reverse that process, which I believe is a low carb diet, is to lower that blood sugar level. And then after a while, those organs are looking around for a source of energy. They don't see that blood glucose that's around normally, but they still need energy. So then they look down at that midsection and say, oh, there's a source of energy, that fat that's around the midsection. Let's break that down into fatty acids, and that will be our source of energy. And when that happens, blood glucose gets controlled, and eventually weight is lost as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm following you. I get it. And I'm pretty sure most of the people listening got it because you've explained it really clearly. And yet, I've not heard many doctors, I haven't met that many hundreds of doctors, but I've not heard many doctors explain or even mention insulin resistance, as you were saying, let alone explain it. I mean, it seems relatively simple. Why isn't it talked about more?
Yeah, again, there are a lot of forces that move us in the opposite direction. One is, the United States Department of Agriculture recommendations with the food industry. The other is there's no direct treatment other than diet and strength training primarily that we'll talk about to reverse insulin resistance. So there's no pharmaceutical industry incentive to push that. And then the other one is the food processing industry, and I understand it's a business. I'm not going to demonize a business model, but cheap processed foods consist of seed oils, which are inflammatory, sugar, and refined grains. Refined grains because that creates a long shelf life. And so all the forces are pushing us in that direction. And unfortunately, doctors and healthcare has not done a good job of countering that.
Yeah. Well, it's, I suppose, reassuring to hear a doctor say that, although I'm not quite sure how reassured I feel.
Well, I hope so. I now have those docs that don't have enough time in their office. referring me patients. And initially they were looking at me like, well, what's this low carb doctor doing over there? This insulin resistance doctor. I'm not so certain what he's doing. But when they send their patients to me and their hypertension gets lowered and their pre-diabetes gets reversed and they lose some weight, then they begin to understand. And despite all the forces pushing the opposite direction, I think there's a metabolic health movement. I was in Florida about 2 months ago with a group of metabolic health doctors. Low Carb USA is the organization that puts it on. They do a great job, and there is a movement, and people are beginning to understand that what we've done for the last 50 years hasn't worked in any way, shape, or form. And that there has to be a different approach. And so there are not a lot of us right now, but I think our voice is growing.
Yes, yes, it seemed that way on the consumer slash patient side as well, even outside of the States. And it's like a new thing coming along now. Although we were talking just before we started recording, and it's not new at all, how diet can affect your health. So why is it such a big deal? I mean, they were doing this way before the 70s fad about, low fat, high carb stuff ever started.
Right. I mean, you look at photos or movies from the 50s and 60s, you don't see obese people. But again, healthcare has kind of moved in the direction of technology and pharmaceutical intervention. And I think we've got away from the basics. We may get into this discussion a little bit when we talk about the new medicines. There's the lifestyle changes, maybe requiring a little bit more discipline, or there's the reach for the medication approach. And unfortunately, it is human nature to look for the easy approach unless you have a fundamental understanding of what's going on with your physiology. And that's why, I believe that continuous glucose monitors are such a great tool because they give people that insight.
I want to take a quick break to say that if this is your first time here, then welcome and thank you for listening to this podcast. And whether you're new or a regular and you haven't yet rated or reviewed this podcast, could I ask you to scroll down and tap on the stars to rate this podcast and also to write a short review to let me know how this podcast is helping you in your life after sugar. I love reading your reviews. And when you rate and review this podcast, not only does it encourage me to continue making new episodes, but it also helps to share this podcast and have more people see it so that we can help more people feel better and lose weight with less sugar. So again, thank you for rating and reviewing this podcast and for spreading the word about sugar. All right, well, let's dive into the continuous glucose monitors, CGMs, and these new drugs that are all the rage, right? So can you tell us a little bit about your use of those and your position about them?
So first of all, regarding CGMs were originally developed for patients on insulin, and it was used to dose your insulin. I think they are tremendous tools in non-diabetics and pre-diabetics, especially if you're overweight or you have a history of pre-diabetes or diabetes in your family. The way I use them is I bring people in and we put a continuous glucose monitor on them. These are the devices that people wear on the back of their arms. You see them in diabetics more and more being used by non-diabetics, and they give you a 24/7 reading of your blood glucose. So the way I use them is first in a diagnostic phase where we put a CGM on a patient and we say, don't change your diet. Leave your diet exactly as it is. Let's see where you live in terms of what's going on with your blood sugar. Now, I have a patient population that comes to me because they're overweight, maybe have prediabetes or diabetes in their family, so they're concerned. But What happens is they then see those spikes in blood sugar as a result of their diet, whether it be sugar, which will spike it fast, or carbs, which will spike it relatively fast. And they see what's going on with their physiology. And the way some of my patients have put it is, well, once you see that, you can't unsee it. Once you see those spikes and drops and those persistent elevations, and you understand the inflammation that that's causing in your body, you can't unsee it. So we then take that information along with a fasting insulin level. And I don't know if you've talked much about fasting insulin levels and doing a calculation of insulin resistance, which you can do. So you take a fasting insulin level and a fasting blood sugar, you assess those simultaneously. It gives you a level of insulin resistance. You take the CGM data, and then based on that, you put a program together which allows people to reverse their insulin resistance, maybe completely reverse their prediabetes. And I've even helped diabetic patients get off their medication. I'm not bold enough to say I've reversed their diabetes or ended their diabetes. They still probably have some underlying insulin resistance, but we're able to put diabetes in remission for a period of time.
Yeah, that's amazing because diabetes used to be known as progressive and, just uncurable, or at least there's nothing to be done other than meds.
Right. Absolutely. So I think the most critical phase is, so you become diabetic. Hopefully you get educated and how to address that. Unfortunately, as we were talking about before we started, the approach should not be just, keep taking more insulin and that'll help control your blood sugar. It really needs to be a dietary and an activity focus. But I think prediabetes is a hugely important time because you can reverse your prediabetes, and prevent yourself ever from progressing to diabetes. And unfortunately, I think in medicine we have this casual approach to prediabetes, as in, oh, your blood sugar is a little bit high. If you're seeing your doctor, oh, we'll check it again next year and make sure it looks good. If your blood sugar is 103, lights and sirens should be going off, because that means you probably had insulin resistance going on for 3, 4, 5 years. And now is the time to address it, because you can completely reverse your prediabetes and prevent ever becoming diabetic.
Yes, yes. I think prevention, is not, how shall I put this politely, not the big deal that it should be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So you were talking about like the therapeutic use of diet. Now,
Yeah.
how can you succeed where so many other doctors have not been able to in making people like change their diets?
I think once people understand, first of all, I'm going to come back to the CGMs. They can be life-changing. Once people see that data, they can't unsee it. The doctor may have been talking to them for years about your high blood sugar. But once you understand what's going on with your physiology, it helps you gravitate toward a lifestyle change. You aren't just making a lifestyle change for the sake of a lifestyle change, or just to lose weight. You actually understand what's going on with your physiology. And once people reach that deeper understanding, they embrace it. And it becomes more natural. There's the calories in, calories out method of losing weight, which I don't think is sustainable over a period of time. Or there's this insulin resistance model of reversing insulin resistance, which I think is the best approach. And so we talk about first the diagnostic phase, and then from a therapeutic standpoint, there are basically three legs of the stool, now a fourth if you want to include the medications. We'll talk about that. But the three legs are low carb. And I have the patients often use the CGM going forward to guide their diet so they can continue to get information on what foods are best for them to approach. And, we're going to set goals about, let's keep your spikes this low and let's keep your averages this low. And I usually shoot for about 50 grams a day in my patients in terms of carbohydrate intake. The other thing we do is push the protein, because strength training is an important part of this as well. We'll talk in a second. And I'm a little bit of an unusual doctor because I tell patients, keep your carbs low, keep your protein high, and let's not worry about your fat that much. And that's not entirely true. We focus on good fats and bad fats, but I'm more focused on low carb and high protein.
Mhm.
Then we add intermittent fasting to that, and then eventually strength training.
Fantastic. Okay. Wow. That is pretty rare as far as I know.
Yeah, it's a great plan and people embrace it. The second fastest way to lower insulin resistance after low carb is intermittent fasting. And then that third component, which is important for all of us as we get older, we're losing muscle mass as we age. And especially important for women because your amount of muscle mass relates to your amount of osteoporosis that you're going to be at risk for as you get older. And what happens with strength training, which is really the approach that I think should be taken for people with insulin resistance, is you're increasing the quality and the receptivity of the insulin receptors on a larger amount of muscle mass. So that also helps you with your insulin resistance and keep your blood glucose low.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yes. So diet, strength training. What was the third one?
Fasting, intermittent fasting.
Intermittent
Yeah,
fasting,
and
which
yeah, you don't have to fast for 24 or 36 hours. I just, most of my patients, are 14-hour fasters, maybe a little bit more if they choose to, or once in a while a 24-hour fast. But you don't have to be fasting 36 or 72 hours. You just need to kind of introduce a time away from food, like quite honestly, our ancestors did for centuries when, we were either hunter-gatherers and we didn't have a good hunt or when we were in an agricultural society and we had a bad year in terms of crops. So this is something that, humans have done for, tens of thousands of years. And I think it's very healthy to be fasting occasionally.
all right, all right. And the fourth part that you were mentioning are these new, is it
Yeah,
GLP-1? What does that
GLP-1,
stand for?
um, glucagon-like proteins.
Okay,
Okay. Glucagon-like, actually, it's glucagon-like peptides. And they are basically gastrointestinal hormones.
okay.
Okay. So these medications mimic those gastrointestinal hormones. And they're all the rage right now. All the people in Hollywood are on them, of course. I think there are medications that are going to become very prominent. I think, as we were talking before, the genie is out of the bottle on these medications. People are going to use them. So my goal is if a patient that I'm working with wants to look at using them, that they're used correctly. And correctly in my mind means you got to be doing all the things we've talked about up to now. Okay, low carb, intermittent fasting, strength training. And then the goal of using these medications is beginning their use with the end in mind. And the end in mind is getting off the medications. It's not, that I'm going to give a patient a medication and they're going to become dependent on it for a lifetime. Because dependence can occur because there is weight regain when you go off the medications. And while you're on them, you also lose muscle mass. So really, if you're going to dip your toe in the waters of using these medications, my suggestion is that they be used at low doses, not maximal doses, but low doses, and for limited periods of time to avoid this dependency. And then you achieve these lifestyle changes. I believe low carb becomes a lifestyle change that people can embrace for their entire lifetime, and that will avoid this lifelong dependency on these medications.
Okay. And what percentage of your patients would you say choose to take these drugs?
Yeah, my patient population, about 20% of the patients use these medications. I usually use them in two instances. One is when a patient has been doing everything right, they've been working really hard, but they hit a stall. And that often happens with women primarily because of the hormonal issues. And we want to get them through a little bit of a plateau in their weight loss journey. And these are people sometimes that need to lose 60 or 70 pounds and they've lost 25 or 30, but now they need a little bit more help. The second time, which I'm going to be honest, I'm a little bit conflicted about using them, is when somebody comes to me and they want to use the medications right out of the gate. And this is my perspective, for better or worse, is that this person is focused on using these medications. And if they don't work with somebody that's knowledgeable in these other modalities, they're just going to get it off the internet and they're just going to be taking a shot and they're going to become dependent and they aren't going to be doing the other things. So after a long discussion with people, I will occasionally use them. out of the gate, so to speak, but only if they agree to do the other things that I think are absolutely essential.
Okay, all right, all right. And can I ask, just going back to your studies, your med studies at med school, how many hours of training in nutrition did they give you?
So you alluded to this before we got on, and I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm sure I had 3 or 4 hours of training. I don't remember it, to tell
Mhm.
you the truth. It's so de-emphasized. Just like insulin resistance wasn't really a model that was taught, it's so de-emphasized. So unfortunately, we don't spend a lot of time on it. I think, unfortunately, in the period of time I went through medical school, the wrong principles may have been emphasized again because of the food pyramid thing and the cholesterol issue. So maybe I've selectively blocked it from my memory for a
Maybe.
reason. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's very often we see disclaimers, including my own, of, go see a doctor. None of this is medical advice, which is not, but check it out with your doctor for anything like that. But then I'm thinking, but the doctor's only had like 3 or 4 hours of nutrition training. So poor patient.
Yeah. And I don't think it's changed today greatly, to tell you the truth. I don't think any of that's changed, either the time spent on it or the models that are taught. So,
Yeah.
medicine changes at a glacial pace. So, unfortunately, I think it's going to take many more years before this becomes a standard approach. I think it's the correct approach. I think it's undeniable from a scientific perspective. But the incentives are in the other direction, and it'll take some time for things to change.
So what do we as patients and as consumers as well, what do we do to advocate for our own health and to find the right information in the right place?
Yeah, I think that there's more and more information out there now with podcasts like yours, for example, books like mine, that you can have the opportunity to educate yourself. So once you have an understanding that there might be a different path, just build your knowledge base. Build a factual knowledge base, and I believe that will bring you to the truth. And I passionately believe, after being fortunate to work with hundreds of patients, that the truth is this approach that we have outlined in terms of reversing insulin resistance, low carb intermittent fasting, and strength training. So I think you build a foundation, and I think if you delve into a diet or an approach without that fundamental underlying knowledge, then it might be short-lived. So learn about insulin resistance. Learn that glucose molecules attach to your blood vessel linings and your cartilage to cause inflammation. Understand that physiology. Get a CGM and see what's going on with the spikes or the potentially higher numbers, and educate yourself. And once you do that, I think it makes embracing this healthier lifestyle a lot easier.
Oh, totally agree. And I say this as a teacher rather than as a doctor. Knowledge is power.
Yeah, absolutely. People have the power to control their health. A lot of times we don't yet, don't turn your future health over to somebody else. Okay,
Mm,
if you got a doctor that you trust and believe in, then that's great, but it doesn't mean you don't question them. Okay? So educate yourself and build your own model. It's important.
love it.
We're all busy, but this is a critical thing to do if you want to stay healthy into middle and older ages.
Yeah, yeah. Love that message. And you mentioned your book. Can you tell us about your book?
So the reason I wrote the book, it's called The Continuous Glucose Monitor Revolution, and it's available on Amazon. Actually, The Continuous Glucose Monitor Revolution for non-diabetics, because I think the value of these devices in non-diabetics, people that are overweight, people that have family history of diabetes, pre-diabetics, it is just so impactful. The use is so impactful. When people see what's going on with their physiology, they see those curves. I don't want to be too trite, but it can be life changing because they understand for the first time what's going on. And then they modify their diet and they understand how to control that. You spike your blood sugar and it drops, and you get that, post spike fatigue. That there's a reason for that, and you can correlate the two. You begin to understand that. And there's a movement, and I don't know if you've looked at this much, but there's also a movement that by stabilizing blood sugars, you can improve mental health as well. I'll throw in, there's a guy named Chris Palmer who's a Harvard psychiatrist. Have you talked with him at all?
No,
Oh,
I'd like to.
so I'm not going to push keto too much here because most of my patients are low carb and not keto. But the origin of the keto diet was treating kids that had seizures. So for years and years before we had medications to treat seizures, pediatric seizures were treated with a keto diet, which greatly reduced the number of seizures that the kids had. Well, there's a whole focus now on low carb and keto diets improving mental health, and not only mental clarity, which I think unquestionably occurs if you can avoid these peaks and valleys, but also potentially maybe even some diseases like, to some degree, anxiety or depression. So, it's just another reason to get on the low carb keto bandwagon, I think.
Yeah, wonderful. And maybe one day it won't even be called low carb, it'll just be called normal.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, we can dream about that day.
Yeah, yeah. If you can dream it, you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, very enlightening. And I feel a lot more hopeful for the future of medicine with doctors like yourself.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to say.
Thank you. Wow, what a fascinating chat with Dr. Paul. And it's true, I do feel more hopeful that doctors are more likely to receive the training that they need, training about nutrition in general, but more specifically about insulin resistance, about sugar, and about intermittent fasting, but also that we as patients can learn to educate ourselves about these issues and become more empowered, and who knows, maybe educate our own doctors. And if this episode of the Life After Sugar podcast has inspired you to start living your life after sugar, especially to get rid of cravings and slim down and finally feel in control around food, then that's exactly what you'll get in the Freedom from Cravings Formula 90-day program. It's a program that's specifically designed for women over 50 who want to get rid of cravings and live the long-term benefits of a sugar-free life sustainably. In the program, you'll get step-by-step guidance and customized support through the 5-step formula that I've developed to help you get control over cravings so that you can finally live your life with more energy and fit into your favorite clothes effortlessly and feel confident in your food choices so that you can ditch the shame and embarrassment that you feel every time your emotions make you slip or fall off the wagon, and so that you never feel like you're on some kind of a restrictive diet. If you're at the stage of your life where you're finally ready to invest in yourself after all these years of taking care of others, let's chat. You can hop on a free clarity call with me at any time by going to aftersugarclub.com and clicking on the big green button, Schedule a Clarity Call. We'll have a quick 30-minute one-on-one chat to see if the Freedom from Cravings Formula 90-day program is a good fit for you. So go to aftersugarclub.com. Speak soon. That's it for this week. Keep in touch and see you soon for another episode.